The scent of jollof rice, rich with thyme and Scotch bonnet, should have been a comfort, but in the sterile, sandalwood-scented air of the Seoul penthouse, it was a death warrant. Saad stood frozen at the edge of the dining table, her gaze locked on the center of the spread. There, resting against a crystal water glass, was a bracelet of clay beads and dried grass, the one she had woven for Amina the morning she fled Lagos. It was damp, smelling of the salt and diesel of the Incheon docks. Min Jae moved past her, his footsteps silent, his dark eyes scanning the room with a lethal intensity that suggested he was already counting the bodies he would need to drop to fix this. He didn't look at the food. He looked at the shadows in the corner of the kitchen, then back at the reinforced steel door that had been bypassed without a single alarm being triggered. The security logs were wiped 30 seconds before we entered, Min Jae said, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that carried the weight of the Shadow King in full fury. He reached out, his fingers hovering just inches from the beaded bracelet. This wasn't an Azakai hit team. They don't have the finesse to walk through my firewalls like there's smoke. Saad felt the familiar, cold dread of Lagos rising in her throat. A familiar dread she hadn't felt since her father's blood had pooled on their veranda. She reached for the bracelet, her fingers trembling. If it isn't the cartel, then who? Who else knows the exact seasoning of my mother's kitchen? Who else knows Amina is the only thing that could make me break? Min Jae turned to her, his expression cracking to reveal a rare, haunted vulnerability. He took her hand, his thumb tracing the platinum ring on her finger, the blood debt that had become a vow. There is only one person who could bypass my life and leave a meal as a calling card, he murmured. The woman who taught me that the most effective way to kill a man is to make him feel safe before the blade sinks in. Sada's eyes narrowed, her tactical training sharpening her focus. Your mentor, Ji-hai, Min Jae said, the name sounding like a curse. The underworld calls her the Weaver. She doesn't just pull triggers. She weaves circumstances until her targets have nowhere left to run. She was the one who forged the Winter Dragon. And if she is here, it means the Azakai didn't just hire a mercenary. They hired the only person who knows my blind spots as well as I do. He picked up the bracelet, his jaw clenching until the bone looked ready to snap. She's using your sister to thread a needle, Saad. She wants to see if the king I've become is still the boy she trained, or if I've grown soft enough to be unraveled by love. Saad looked at the meal, then at the dark skyline of the city they had fought so hard to rule. The invisible servitude was over, but the war had followed them into the light. Then let her weave, Saad whispered, her voice steady and sharp. She might know your blind spots, Min Jae, but she doesn't know mine. The obsidian table of the council chamber felt colder than usual, the air thick with a mutiny that had been simmering since the night Saad first humiliated them with their own security flaws. Elder Quan didn't look at Saad. He looked through her, his gaze fixed on Min Jae with the predatory patience of a man who had waited decades for a moment of weakness. A hostage crisis in Lagos is not a Korean problem, Quan stated, his voice like the scrape of a blade against stone. The Azakai have sent their terms. They want the northern ports and your resignation, Min Jae. They claim the foreigner's sister is a small price to pay for the stability of our entire organization. Min Jae's hand tightened on the arm of his chair, the leather creaking under the strain. Beside him, Saad felt the Shadow King's fury vibrating like a low-frequency hum, but she didn't wait for him to speak. She had spent too many months being the help, a Nigerian woman cleaning floors, while men like Quan decided her worth. You speak of stability, Saad said, her voice dropping into a dangerous, tactical calm that silenced the room. She stood, the crimson silk of her gown pooling around her like a promise of blood. But you are actually speaking of cowardice. You would hand over our ports, the lifeblood of this empire, because you are afraid of a ghost from my past. We are afraid of a king who has lost his edge to a maid. A younger lieutenant spat, his hand moving toward the pistol tucked into his waistband. You are an unknown quantity who has brought nothing but change and danger to this table. The room moved in a blur of practiced violence. Before the lieutenant could clear his holster, Sada's hand was a flash of movement. She didn't use a gun. She used the ceramic blade she had carried since the night the Weaver invaded her kitchen. The steel bit deep into the oak table, inches from the lieutenant's fingers, pinning his sleeve to the wood. I didn't just take 4 bullets for this family to watch you give it away, Saad whispered, leaning over the table until she was eye to eye with Elder Kwan. You think Amina is a ransom? She is a park. And in this world, no one moves against a park without declaring war on the entire organization. She turned to Min-jae, her eyes blazing with the tactical resolve of her father. The council has forgotten who they serve. They think they can negotiate with the Azakai by sacrificing what is ours. Min-jae stood, his presence suddenly filling the room with an authority that made even Kwan flinch. My wife is right, he said, his voice ice. The council is no longer a circle of advisors. You are a weight I am no longer willing to carry. With a single, sharp gesture to June, the doors hissed open, and loyalist guards flooded the perimeter. Saad didn't flinch as the Shadow King personally stripped the ranks from the men who had doubted her. By the time the sun began to rise over the Han River, the council was no longer a threat. Saad had proven that she wasn't just a witness or a partner. She was the sovereign who would burn the world down to bring her sister home. The heat of Lagos hit Saad like a physical weight the moment the private jet seal broke, a thick, humid pressure smelling of salt, exhaust, and the spicy tang of street food that she had spent 8 months trying to scrub from her soul. She stepped onto the tarmac not as the invisible servant who had fled in the dead of night, but as a sovereign returned to her kingdom. Behind her, Min-jae emerged, his sharp-edged Korean suit replaced by dark, breathable linens, his calculating eyes taking in the chaotic rhythm of the Murtala Muhammad Airport with the wary respect of one apex predator entering another's territory. This is not Seoul, Saad said, her voice dropping into a low, melodic tone that carried the cadence of her father's authority. She didn't look back to see if he was following. She knew he was, his presence a possessive protector at her shoulder. In this city, power isn't held in glass towers. It's held in the markets, in the alleyways, and in the hands of people who know how to make the humidity work for them. They bypassed the standard customs lines, led by a local fixer who had once been on her father's payroll. As they moved through the terminal, Saad noticed the way the local security guards' eyes lingered on her, not with the prejudice she had faced in the Korean mansion, but with a growing, startled recognition. The daughter of Chief Adeyemi, the tactical advisor of the underworld, was no longer a ghost. We are being watched, Min-jae murmured, his hand instinctively ghosting near the concealed weapon at his waist. Let them watch, Saad replied, leading him toward a blacked-out SUV idling at the curb. In Lagos, being seen is a defensive strategy. If they know I am back, the Azakai will have to move their pieces, and that is when they make mistakes. As they drove through the sprawling, vibrant chaos of the city toward the Victoria Island docks, Saad took the lead, her tactical training mapping the familiar streets. She navigated the driver through blind spots and secondary routes her father had taught her, a reconnaissance and strike flow that Min-jae watched with a mixture of dark pride and quiet intensity. You move differently here, Min-jae noted, his thumb tracing the platinum ring on her finger as the car vibrated over the uneven pavement. In Seoul, you were a shadow trying to hide. Here, you are the fire. I spent my life surviving this fire, Min-jae, she said, her gaze fixed on the passing slums and luxury estates that defined her childhood. Now, I'm going to use it to burn the Azakai out of their holes. She signaled the driver to stop near a dilapidated veranda in a district known for its illegal smuggling routes. It was an old haunt of her father's, a place where information was the only currency that mattered. Saad stepped out of the car, her posture tense, alert, and instinctively guarded, a queen ready to reclaim her throne. Min-jae stepped out beside her, his Shadow King, aura blending with the local heat to form a united, powerful couple that even the most hardened street soldiers hesitated to challenge. The veranda was a skeletal ruin of colonial grandeur, its white paint peeling like dead skin under the oppressive Lagos sun. It was here, in this world of violence, that Saad's father had once brokered the deals that kept the city's heart beating. As Saad stepped onto the cracked tiles, the familiar dread she had carried since the night of her father's murder tightened its grip on her chest. Standing in the flickering shade of a rusted ceiling fan was Uncle Femi, a man who had been her father's most trusted advisor until the night the bullets started flying. Min-jae moved like a demon unleashed into the space, his dark, calculating eyes assessing every shadow for the signature of violence. He didn't speak. He stood behind Saad, a possessive protector whose very presence filled the dilapidated porch with the Shadow King's lethal authority. "You have the look of a ghost, Saad," Femi whispered, his voice a gravelly rasp. He looked at the platinum ring on her finger, then at the winter dragon standing in his shadows. "I heard you had become Mrs. Park, but I didn't believe the daughter of Chief Adeyemi would ever truly bow to another king." "I didn't come here for a blessing, Femi," Saad said, her voice dropping into the tactical, sharp cadence of a woman who had survived Lagos and its betrayals. She stepped closer, her posture tense, alert, and instinctively guarded. "The Azakai have my sister. You were the facilitator for their northern routes. You know where they've taken her." Femi's gaze shifted to Min-jae, a flicker of fear crossing his aged features as he realized the Shadow King wasn't there to negotiate. "The Weaver has her," Femi admitted, the name causing Min-jae's jaw to tighten with controlled fury. "She's being held at the stronghold near the Eco-Atlantic docks. They're waiting for you to make a move, Saad. They want to see if you've grown soft in your invisible servitude in Seoul." "I grew sharp," Saad corrected, her hand instinctively ghosting toward the ceramic blade tucked into her gear. She turned to Min-jae, their eyes meeting in a moment of unmistakable respect and shared tactical resolve. They were a united front now, two survivors ready to see the whole board and burn anyone who stood in their way. "Tell the Weaver we're coming," Min-jae said, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that promised total elimination for anyone who touched what belonged to him. He took Sada's hand, their fingers interlaced like teenagers, yet weighted with the blood debt of sovereigns. Femi watched them leave, his expression complicated as he realized that the maid he remembered was gone. In her place was a woman who had earned her place through blood and sacrifice, and a king who would declare war on anyone who dared to challenge her. The Lagos Lagoon was a soup of gray mist and oily water, churning violently as the twin engines of their sleek interceptor roared. Saad gripped the center console, her soaked hair clinging to her face, as they sliced through the wake of a trailing Azakai skiff. Behind them, the air was shredded by the signature of violence, automatic gunfire echoing off the stilt houses of Makoko. Min-jae stood at the stern, a demon unleashed as he returned fire, his dark eyes calculating the trajectory of the pursuing boats with military precision. "They're pinning us against the shipping lanes." Min-jae roared over the engine's whine, his jaw tightened with controlled fury. Suddenly, a heavy thud rocked the boat as a bullet found its mark. June, the Shadow King's right-hand man, collapsed against the railing, blood spreading in warm rivulets across his tactical vest. Saad didn't hesitate. She moved on pure instinct, dropping beside him even as a second skiff pulled alongside, its automatic weapons trained on anything that moved. The strange floating sensation of the battlefield took over, her nursing training overriding the shock and blood loss of the situation. She ripped open June's vest, her trembling hands finding the arterial spray. "He's in shock," she yelled to Min-jae, who was now shielding her body with his own, his hands shaking as he swapped magazines. Using a sterile field kit she'd been in the kitchen preparing for just such a scenario, Saad applied a pressure dressing with tactical precision. She didn't have a hospital, only the visceral memory of the night her father's blood had pooled on their veranda to guide her. As bullets whistled past, she performed a makeshift cauterization using a silver letter opener heated by a flare, her gaze shifting, calculating and aware of the closing enemy skiff. "Saad, get down." Min-jae lunged, his thumb moving unconsciously across her knuckles for a fleeting second of protection before he launched a grenade into the lead skiff. The explosion sent a kaleidoscope of white-hot pain and darkness across the water, the shockwave rocking their interceptor. June's pulse stabilized under her hands. He was breathing, alive, because she had thrown herself between him and death. Saad looked up, her eyes filled with shock and something deeper, recognition of the winter dragon's fierce pride as he watched her. "He's stable," she gasped, her simple, modest gear now stained with blood. Min-jae grabbed the throttle, sliding across the blood-slicked deck to pull the boat into a hard bank. "Then let's finish this," he rasped, his voice breaking with the intensity of his blood debt to her. They were no longer just a united front. They were a power couple forged in the same fire, racing toward the stronghold where the final unpleasant truths awaited. The iron-scented air of the Eco-Atlantic docks hung heavy, thick with the signature of violence that always preceded a confrontation with the Weaver. Min-jae stepped into the center of the rusted warehouse, his dark eyes scanning the rafters where the shadows seemed to shift with predatory intent. From the gloom emerged Ji-hai, her presence as sharp-edged and devastatingly handsome as the man she had forged in the fires of the Seoul underworld. She moved with the military precision of a master who had never known defeat, her gaze calculating the worth of Min-jae and finding him wanting. "You've grown sentimental, Min-jae," the Weaver said, her voice a low, vibrating rasp that carried the chill of the Winter Dragon's own blood. She looked toward the darkened corner where Amina was bound, then back at the platinum ring on Min-jae's finger. "You've traded your eyes for a blood debt to a maid. You've let family become a vulnerability instead of a weapon." Min-jae didn't answer with words. He moved with terrifying speed, his Shadow King aura clashing with the woman who had taught him that trust is a liability. The duel was a blur of wet steel, a rhythmic exchange of calculated angles and lethal intensity. The Weaver was faster, her strikes military-grade and brutal, but Min-jae fought with a desperation born of weeks of tension and a near-death experience that Ji-hai could not comprehend. "You can't win," she hissed, her blade grazing his skull as she pinned him against a shipping container. "You're distracted by the thought of her safety. You're vulnerable because you have something to lose." Min-jae's jaw tightened, and he caught her wrist in a possessive, grounding heat that shattered her composure. "I'm not distracted, Ji-hai," he rasped, his voice breaking with the raw, unleashed fury of a man who had found something worth protecting beyond his empire. "I'm alive in a way you've never been. I've found a home and a family that makes your cold world look like invisible servitude." With a decisive move, he disarmed her, the Winter Dragon, finally surpassing the mentor who had tried to unravel him. He stood over her, his expression transformed from ice water to human, the traitor finally exposed and dealt with. He didn't kill her. He honored the debt in the old way, leaving her broken and confessing in the ruins of her own web. He turned toward Saad, who had emerged from the shadows with Amina in her arms, her eyes filled with tears of joy. Min-jae took her hand, their fingers interlaced as they stood as two sovereigns in the same fire that had tried to consume them. The fortress was a monolith of rusted iron and concrete overlooking the Lagos Lagoon, vibrating with the low hum of generators and the restless energy of cartel soldiers. While Min-jae unleashed the raw, unleashed fury of the Shadow King at the front gates, an explosion of gunfire and military-grade distractions that drew every eye toward the main perimeter, Saad became a ghost. She slipped through the service entrance, her posture collapsing into the invisible servitude she had perfected over 8 months in Seoul. She wasn't the Mafia queen in this moment. She was just the help, a woman in a simple, modest dress carrying a tray of cleaning supplies, blending into the background of a world that viewed her as nothing more than the help. Her tactical training allowed her to assess the threat and navigate the blind spots in the security camera coverage with a precision her father had forged in her years ago. She moved through the corridors, her gaze shifting, calculating and aware, noticing the signature of violence in the way the guards held their weapons. Every guard she passed dismissed her as beneath their notice, a foreign girl who didn't belong in their war zone. But beneath the fragile presence, Saad was calculating the worth of every obstacle, her trembling hands ready to draw the ceramic blade tucked against her skin. She found the sub-basement holding cells by following the rhythm of the facility's security schedules, a pattern she had learned to spot while dusting the monitors in Min-jae's own home. When she finally reached the heavy steel door, she didn't use force, She used the intelligence she'd gathered from befriending the younger maids back in the mansion, using a stolen keycard to bypass the electronic lock. Amina was huddled in the corner, shaking with pure terror, her eyes wide and fearful. When she saw Saad, she didn't see a maid. She saw the strongest person she knew, a woman who had survived Lagos and survived losing everything. "I'm here," Saad managed to whisper, her voice barely a whisper as she cut the bindings. The distant sound of Minjae's assault grew louder, a roar that made even the walls step back, signaling that her partner was closing the distance. Saad pulled Amina to her feet, her posture tense, alert, and instinctively guarded, shifting from victim to warrior. She looked at her sister with unmistakable respect for her survival. "We aren't waiting for the next attempt," Saad said, her voice steady and sharp. "We're actively fighting back now." Together, they moved into the shadows of the fortress, the invisible Maid finally stepping into the light to build something better than survival. The air in the heart of the stronghold was thick with this signature of violence, a heavy, metallic scent that Saad had recognized from her nursing training as the smell of impending death. She moved through the flickering fluorescent shadows of the command center, Amina safely tucked into a secure alcove behind her. Standing by the glass wall overlooking the burning lagoons was the man who had haunted her dying consciousness for 2 years. Chairman Arins, the cartel leader who had murdered her father in front of his family to send a professional, brutal message. He didn't look like a demon unleashed. He looked like a calculating businessman whose ice water in his veins was finally beginning to boil with fear. He turned to face her, his eyes calculating the worth of the woman standing before him, and, for the first time, finding his own life wanting. "You should have stayed nothing more than the help in soul, Saad." Arin sneered, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that carried the cold efficiency of a killer. "You were invisible there. Here, you are just a loose end I forgot to tie." "I wasn't invisible," Saad corrected, her voice steady and sharp as she stepped into the light, the platinum ring on her finger catching the fire from the docks below. "I was learning to see danger before it sees me. I was forged in the same fire that forged the man who is currently dismantling your empire outside those doors." Arin's lunged for a silenced pistol on his desk, but Sada's body moved on pure instinct. She didn't hesitate. She didn't freeze. With a decisive move, she closed the distance, her ceramic blade flashing in a kaleidoscope of white-hot pain for the man who had stolen everything from her. The struggle was brief and brutal. She pinned him against the glass, the raw, unleashed fury of a warrior queen radiating from her as she held the blade to his throat. For a fleeting second, she saw the fear in his eyes, the same fear her father must have felt. "Mercy is for those who honor their debts," Saad whispered, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, as intimate as a vow. "In my world, we pay in blood and sacrifice." She didn't look away when she struck the final blow. It wasn't a random act of panic. It was training, a calculated act of justice that transcended money. As Arin slumped to the floor, the traitor was finally purged, and the ghost of Lagos was laid to rest. Saad stood in the smoke-filled chaos, her posture tense, alert, and instinctively guarded. No longer a survivor, but an executioner who had earned her place at the Shadow King's side. The return to Seoul was not the quiet retreat of a ghost, but the triumphant arrival of a dynasty. As the armored motorcade glided through the rain-slicked streets toward the Park Mansion, Saad sat in the back of the sedan, her hand interlaced with Minjae's, while Amina slept soundly against her other shoulder. The city lights reflected off the bulletproof glass, a kaleidoscope of white-hot neon that no longer signaled pain and darkness, but the boundaries of their sovereign territory. The mansion staff was lined up in the foyer, bowing deeply as they addressed Saad as Madam Park with a warmth and unmistakable respect that had been earned through blood and sacrifice. Mrs. Choi stood at the front, her eyes misting as she saw Amina, welcoming the young girl into the East Wing with the same tenderness she had once shown a foreign girl struggling with Korean. The Shadow Empire had been purged of its traitors, and in their place stood a family fortress built on loyalty proven in blood. That evening, the storm finally broke, leaving the Seoul skyline painted in shades of orange and gold. Saad, Min-jae, and Amina stood together on the penthouse balcony, overlooking the vast, glittering expanse of their world. Min-jae had removed his suit jacket, his thumb moving unconsciously across Saada's knuckles as they stood in a charged silence that was perfect. "You said this life carried danger and weight," Saad murmured, leaning her head against Min-jae's shoulder as she watched her sister marvel at the city lights. "But standing here, it feels like the first time I've actually been able to breathe." "It's because you aren't surviving anymore, Saad," Min-jae replied, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that was both tender and a promise. He looked from his wife to the young girl who now shared his name. His expression transformed from the winter dragon to a man who loved them more than power. "You've built a home where no one will ever hurt you again." Saad looked at the platinum ring on her finger, then out at the horizon. They were two sovereigns who had thrown themselves into the dangerous world and emerged stronger than me, as Taeyong had once said of her. The Shadow Empire was no longer just a business arrangement or a transaction. It was a dynasty written in sacrifice, survival, and choosing each other every single day. They stood as a united front, three figures against the twilight, ready to see the whole board and stand together when everything tried to tear them apart.